Hey guys, it's Courtney. Today I'm going to be creating 3 cards with the mini stamp set A Little Sparkle by Fawn, and this is part of a collaboration with Mary Polanco and Scrappina Creations. So we are going to jump right into the first card here, and I'm going to take a variety of Copic markers and I'm just going to create a rainbow. And I'm using my T-square ruler here just to make sure my lines are straight, and I'm going to be using the chisel nib to just basically go right along that ruler and move that down a little bit, move on to the next color. I'm slightly overlapping the colors, but making sure that I'm leaving enough space for each color to really have enough room to really shine. You'll notice, if you noticed, the colors that I chose are all similar as far as the last number. So as long as the last number is the same or similar to the one next to it, they will blend. I'm not going over this multiple times. I'm just kind of leaving it as is, but they will blend slightly. Next, I'm going to go ahead and cut this out with a stitched rectangle die, and throughout the video you'll notice that I'm using the same supplies over and over, just to kind of show you that you can get a lot out of just a little, including this little mini stamp set. So next I'm taking a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock here, and I'm going to stamp out my unicorn with Intense Black ink by Simon Says Stamp, which is a Copic safe ink. And we'll move right into the Copic coloring, which I kept very, very simple. I want my unicorn itself to be white, so I'm just adding some shadows. Starting off with the C5, just adding that to the very darkest areas. So basically where her mane or her hair would be over her face and where her legs are kind of tucked behind each other. Next, going in with the C3 and just extending those areas out a little bit further. Next, I'll move on to the C1, and this is where I'll start flicking this color out a little bit. And you'll notice that I am leaving a lot of white space because I want her to appear white. So every white object is still going to have shadows, but you're still going to want to leave some white space. To get rid of those flick lines, I'm going to bring in a colorless blender, and I'm just going to flick from the opposite direction towards that color that I laid down. And it looks kind of muddy right now, but once that ink dries, you'll notice that it gives a much smoother blend. Going to add just a little bit of color to her cheeks and then tone that down with that colorless blender. And for her hair and her tail, I am going to use a variety of colors. Now you may notice that each of the midtones that I choose is one of the colors that I used in the rainbow. I'm just bringing in a shadow color and a highlight color, and I'm just using a 3-color blend on each one of these little sections, I guess you could call them. And I'm pretty much using all of the colors that I used in that rainbow, just kind of mixing them up a little bit. Because these are such teeny tiny areas, I do feel comfortable enough to go right in with my darkest color first. Typically, I do go in with my lightest color to saturate the paper, but it is not necessary. So while I'm finishing up the coloring here, I did want to talk about the hop that we're going to be having, which we kind of mentioned as a spontaneous idea during our live last weekend. So this hop is for everyone. It doesn't matter if you have a YouTube channel or blog. We want everybody who wants to join to be able to join. So there's 3 ways that you can join, either by creating a video, creating a blog post, or by mailing in one of your cards that will be showcased in a video on my channel on that day. The hop will be August 1st. We need an email from you letting me know whether or not you want to join and what you'll be doing, whether it be a video, blog, or sending in your card, by July 10th. On the 11th, you'll all receive an email with further instructions, but feel free to reach out to me before then or after if you have any questions. Everything needs to be received as far as links or your card in the mail by July 26th. So all of the information will be in the email. I'll leave all of the information below in the description box, as well as my email address. And like I said, reach out to me or Mary or Jen with any questions that you may have. So I finished up the coloring here, and then I went ahead and fussy cut this little image out, and I'm just going to add some sparkle with a Nouveau Aqua Shimmer pen to this entire rainbow here. And then I'm going to go ahead and pop up my image, but before that I want to go ahead and stamp out my sentiment. I'm going to adhere my card panel here down with some Tombow Mono Multi Glue onto a top folding white A2 size note card. And I just placed down my little unicorn there for placement only before stamping out my sentiment. I am going to use my grid mat on my work surface here just to line up my sentiment, make sure that's perfectly straight. Pop that onto an acrylic block, and then I'm going to go ahead and stamp this out with black dye ink by Simon Says Stamp. This is a dye ink, but it gives you a really crisp image. I love this for sentiments, and it dries a lot quicker than pigment ink. So I'm going to stamp this right on my rainbow, and then I will pop up my little unicorn there with some Scotch foam tape right beside that. And of course, needing more sparkle, I added a little bit of shimmer with that same Nouveau Aqua Shimmer pen to the mane or hair and the tail of the unicorn, and then added a few glitter drops by Nouveau, and these are the White Blizzard. They're clear with just some clear sparkle to them. So that is the first card. Moving on to the second card, I am going to take some pattern paper here, as well as a piece of white cardstock and a piece of kind of like a turquoise cardstock. And quite honestly, I just got this from my stash. I have no idea what the actual name of this color is. But I cut them down all with that same stitched rectangle die. Now I'm bringing in a stitched border die, and this is by Fawn. Cut that from my white panel, lined that up onto this turquoise panel, and then placed that die right over it to kind of fit like a puzzle piece. Stuck that down with some Post-it note tape and ran that through my Gemini so that I will have a small border once everything is layered together. So I'm going to take that little scrap piece of that white cardstock, which is Neenah Solar White, and again, go ahead and stamp out my unicorn. This time I'm going to switch over to some Memento Tuxedo Black ink, just because my Intense ink Intense black ink is a little dry, like most of my ink pads. I'm in desperate need of some refills. But I went ahead and stamped that out and colored that the same way the first time, so I didn't show you the coloring, but I went ahead and fussy cut that out as well. I had some smudges there that I fixed up with a sand eraser, which is a must-have in the craft room. And then I will go ahead and layer everything together. So I'm using my Tombow Mono Multi Glue. I definitely recommend using a wet glue here because it just gives you a couple of extra seconds to kind of move everything around to make sure everything is lined up correctly. I always seem to struggle with that part, so using a wet glue definitely helps me. So once everything is layered together, I'm going to go ahead and pop this onto a top folding white A2 size note card, again with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue. This way it will leave a small white border on all four sides. And next I'm going to move on to the sentiment, and I'm going to take another piece of that turquoise color cardstock that we used for that little border there and treat that with my anti-static tool and stamp both of my sentiments separately with some Versamark ink. Sprinkle on some white embossing powder, and this is by Hero Arts, and heat set that. And I always make sure that my heat gun is heated up completely before bringing that to the paper. Even though this is just a small sentiment strips, it does kind of minimize the warping and makes cutting these sentiments into little strips a little bit easier. So once they were cut out, I'm gonna pop everything up with some Scotch foam tape, including those little sentiments there. Going to pop up my unicorn, and the sentiments will go directly below her, and then of course gotta add that shimmer again. So use my Nouveau Aqua Shimmer pen to add that sparkle to her mane and her tail, and then once again added some glitter drops kind of just around the sentiment area. And that is it for card number 2. Next, we'll move on to card number 3, and I am again working with a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and this is cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I have a piece of masking paper here, and this is Simon Says Stamp masking paper that I had cut with a circle die. Doesn't matter what circle die, any circle die will do. Going to lay that down onto my card panel, and you can position this anywhere on the card panel that you want. And then I'll stamp out my image. And again, using Tuxedo Black ink by Memento. And I'm going to stamp that directly into my circle, as well as another piece of that Simon Says stamp masking paper, because I will go ahead and fussy cut that out and mask out my image. Now, I didn't stamp this perfectly. A little bit of her tail is kind of hanging beyond the circle, but I'll fix that later on. So I went ahead and masked her out, and then we're going to create our background using a cloud stencil by MFT. You can certainly create your own. I've done videos showing how to make a template for this, so you don't necessarily need to use a stencil for this. But I am going to bring out some spun sugar and worn lipstick distress oxide inks, and just using an ink blending tool. And I'm basically starting right on the stencil and kind of working my way to the paper just a little bit. And I'm kind of twisting and turning that stencil as I move down that circle. All four sides of the stencil have a little bit different of a pattern, but for this small area, I'm just using the same side. Next, I'm going to bring out the worn lipstick, realign that stencil onto that same area that we had before, and I'm adding just a teeny tiny bit of this. Sometimes you can see once I get towards the end, I'm not even adding any more ink to my ink blending tool. I'm just kind of using the ink that's already on the stencil that kind of is just sitting there, and this will just add a little bit more dimension to the clouds, I guess. So you can see that I'm just adding a little bit more to the corners here. I felt like all of my color was kind of leaning off to the right a little bit. So I just added a little bit more. And next I'll add a little bit of sparkle. So I'm bringing out that White Blizzard Nouveau drops once again, going to mask out the bottom portion of my card because I was getting ink everywhere. So to avoid that, I just used some Post-it note tape. I'm squeezing just a little bit of these glitter drops onto the stencil and then using my finger to kind of smush those onto the top portion of my little clouds. And you can add as much or as little as you want, and just using my fingers seemed to work. You can definitely use maybe like a paper towel or something if you don't like to be too messy, but I don't seem to care. So I went ahead and immediately cleaned off my stencil and let this dry for about a half an hour. It dries pretty quickly. And then when you remove your masks, you want to be super careful, especially if you're using the Simon Says stamp masking paper or anything else that's really tacky. Because we've added so much moisture, not only with the ink, but the Nouveau drops, it can tear your paper if you're not careful. And if your ink and your Nouveau drops are not completely dry. So just be sure of that. So once everything was dry, we're going to go ahead and Copic color the unicorn once again. This time I wanted to kind of stick to everything being pink. So I'm going to bring out some RV markers, and I'm going to color the body of the unicorn, basically adding the shading or the shadows the same place I've been adding them this entire time. This time I am using a 4-color blend. Before I only used a 3, but then again we left some white space, so technically I guess we had 4 colors. So this time I am using a 4-color blend, which I typically do in larger areas like this, but just blending that out each time, but leaving a pretty large highlight area for that RV 000, pretty much in the center of her little belly and on the tip of her nose or end of her face, I guess, just because I wanted her to be fairly light. Now for her mane and her tail, I wanted this to be white. So I was going to go in with my C markers. But as you can see, as this sits a little bit, and I don't know whether you can see it on camera, but I had a lot of bleeding, and RV markers can be tricky. All R and RV markers can be tricky. They tend to bleed a lot more than any other color I've noticed. And sometimes they can be a little tricky to blend. So you tend to go over it more, which makes it bleed even more. So you'll see that I kind of went in with my colorless blender multiple times to try to fix those areas up. But as it sat, it continued to bleed even more. Now, some of these areas kind of blended in with the clouds, so it wasn't that big of a deal, but others was really standing out, especially on her mane. So what I ultimately ended up doing was taking an R20, which is a very light pink, and just coloring in the mane and her tail. I've already placed the shading down with those C markers, so I don't need to add any more shading. The shading with those gray markers will show through, but this will just add a little bit of color and look like I used multiple pinks to shade it. but I just couldn't get the RV markers that we used in the beginning completely up. So this was the only way that I was able to really cover that up. I colored her little hooves, I guess, with that same R20 marker just to kind of match everything. And like I said, wanted to make everything pink with the exception of her little horn there, I guess you would call it. I used some C markers for that. So I forgot to mention, use an EK Success journaling pen just to fill in the rest of her little tail that I had cut off with that mask. And that is a Copic Safe pen. So you can use any Copic Safe pen for that. So next I'm going in with a white gel pen to fix up some of those areas that I just wasn't able to completely get up with my colorless blender. Also added a few little dots to her back as well as a few little highlights. And then once again, cutting this down with my stitched rectangle die. Going to layer this onto a light pink cardstock that is cut just a tiny bit bigger than that stitched rectangle die, and then adhere this entire thing to a white A2 size note card. That way it'll just give me a little bit of a border and bring that pink out even more on the edges. So next we're going to move on to the sentiment, and again, more pink. Going to use that same pink cardstock that I used for my backing, and this time we're not going to heat emboss the sentiment. We are going to stamp it separate and create some sentiment strips, but I'm going to stamp this with ultra pink. This is the shadow ink by Hero Arts. Going to stamp those separately onto that cardstock there, and then trim these down into small tiny little strips just slightly larger than the sentiment itself, and pop these up with some foam tape directly under, well, kind of at the edge of my circle, so some of it will overlap just a little bit. Next we are going to add some shimmer with that Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen to the entire unicorn this time, as well as the sentiment strips, and then last finish off once again with the White Blizzard Nuvo drops. So you can see that I use very minimal supplies to create all 3 cards today. So here is a quick look at all 3 cards that we created. Again, all of the hop information will be below, as well as a link to the Scrappina Creations channel, as well as Mary Polanco. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and have a great day.